My name is Margaret Hale, and I am a mother of 3 grown children. I never thought the day would come when I would stand in the middle of a grand celebration, surrounded by chandeliers and polished silverware, and realize that my own children had erased me from the picture. The moment I walked into Riverstone Hall, the music softened for me. Not because anyone lowered the volume, but because I could hear the pounding of my own heart louder than the piano in the corner. Glasses clinked, waiters carried trays of champagne, and laughter spilled across the room. I searched for my place at the long table, my eyes moving quickly from one elegant card to another, but my name was nowhere to be found. I froze. For a few seconds, I convinced myself I must have overlooked it. Perhaps the card had been tucked under a napkin or slid out of place. I leaned forward, scanning again, moving past Daniel, Rebecca, Michael, and then the names of in-laws, friends, even business partners of my children. But not mine. The emptiness where my card should have been felt like a blade against my chest. I glanced at Daniel, my eldest. He looked up, feigning surprise. "Strange," he said, his tone just light enough to pass as careless. Rebecca gave a polite laugh, a rehearsed one, and shrugged. "I'm sure the staff can add another chair." Michael avoided my eyes altogether, swirling his glass of wine as though he'd rather be anywhere else but in this moment with me. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice lodged deep in my throat. I had already learned that silence could be more powerful than anger. So instead of raising my voice, I reached for the phone in my purse. My fingers trembled only slightly as I tapped 6 digits, numbers I had memorized weeks ago, knowing this night might come. Within minutes, the chatter in the room shifted. Waiters paused in the middle of the floor. The kitchen doors swung open, but no trays of appetizers emerged, only confused glances from staff and whispers of delay. And there I stood, without a seat at my children's table, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I still had the power to decide how this evening would unfold. The murmur in the room grew heavier, like a fog that thickened each time a waiter walked past with an empty tray. I could feel the unease spreading, yet no one dared to speak too loudly. I sat down in a chair the staff had pulled from the corner, not because my children insisted, but because the hall manager pitied the sight of me standing alone. My hands folded neatly in my lap, and I allowed myself to sink back into memory. This night was not an accident. It had been set in motion months earlier, the moment I signed the first page of the contract. When Riverstone Hall confirmed the reservation, I wrote the check for the deposit myself, $3,000, a gift from me to what was supposed to be a family celebration. I thought at the time that it was my way of showing support, of telling my children that I believed in the milestones they wanted to mark, birthdays, anniversaries, promotions. Over the years, I had been the one behind the curtain, writing checks, smoothing out details, stepping aside so they could stand in the spotlight. I never once asked for gratitude. A mother should not have to beg for recognition. Respect, however, is not a gift, it is a duty. The sales manager slid the paperwork toward me, and I read every line. My years in finance had left me with habits I never abandoned, double-checking clauses, circling words that might be twisted later. That was when I added the amendment. No final payment. I told them, without my written approval. They hesitated, but my long friendship with Catherine O'Neill, the co-owner of the venue, sealed the matter. She trusted me. She knew my children by reputation, not by character, and she agreed it was safer this way. I smiled politely, signed my name, and tucked the duplicate copy into my leather portfolio. That signature, I knew, was more than ink. It was insurance against the gnawing suspicion that had begun to trouble me. I wish I could say my suspicion had no foundation, but it did. It began with Daniel, my eldest. He had always carried himself as though he were the second head of the family, speaking for me even when I was in the room. "Mom doesn't need to worry about these things," he would say. At first, I let it go, but gradually, his tone sharpened. When we discussed the celebration, he declared, "You should let us handle it entirely. It's our generation's event." His words were coded in respect, but beneath them I heard dismissal. I was no longer the matriarch in his eyes. I was an obstacle. Rebecca followed his lead. My daughter had inherited my stubbornness, but twisted it into pride. One evening, she sat across from me, wine glass in hand, and said, "Mom, you really don't need to come to every meeting. It makes us look like we can't do anything on our own." I remember setting my fork down, studying her face. I wanted to ask, "Do you think you appeared on this earth fully formed? Did you forget who paid your tuition, who sat awake through your fevers?" But I kept silent. I only nodded, the way one nods at a stranger's comment in line at the store. Inside, though, I filed her words away like evidence. Michael was different. He rarely spoke at all, yet his silence carried complicity. He never corrected his brother or sister, never defended me, never insisted I belonged at the table. That, perhaps, cut deeper than their sharp words. A mother can brace against an attack, but silence from a child feels like abandonment. Weeks before the event, Catherine called me. Her tone was careful, almost apologetic. "Margaret, someone tried to submit the final payment form online using your name. The system flagged it. The concierge caught them at the desk later, typing furiously as if they belonged there." She didn't need to say the names. I already knew. The copy of the surveillance photo arrived the next morning, Rebecca leaning over Daniel's shoulder, both of them staring at the screen. I held the picture in my hand for a long time, my stomach hollow. Betrayal does not roar. It whispers first, then waits for the perfect night to shout. That was the night I sat in bed and created the code. 6 digits. A simple sequence only I would know. Catherine built it into the system so that if anything felt wrong, one text from me would freeze the entire event. Not cancel, freeze. The kitchen would stop, the service would stall, and the spotlight would swing from my children back to me. It was not revenge I prepared for. It was survival. I wanted a safeguard for my dignity, should they ever push me from the stage I had built for them. Now, as I sat at Riverstone Hall, my children whispering excuses and guests shifting in discomfort, I realized how right I had been to prepare. They had crossed the line I once prayed they would never approach. They had tried to erase me, and I had chosen silence not as surrender, but as the sharpest weapon I owned. The delay stretched longer than anyone expected. Waiters, trained to glide smoothly between tables, now stood frozen with empty trays. A pair of servers whispered near the bar, eyes darting toward me as though I were the hidden switch that had turned their routine upside down. I could almost hear the questions crawling across the room. Why is nothing coming out of the kitchen? Who is responsible? And why does Margaret look so calm? Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He pulled at his collar, then leaned toward Rebecca. Their whispers carried just enough for me to catch fragments, words like ridiculous and fix it. Rebecca's hand trembled against the stem of her glass. She was a woman who thrived on appearances, and this disruption struck her harder than most. Michael stared down at his lap, tapping his phone as if searching for an escape route. None of them met my eyes. The hall's double doors opened, and Catherine stepped inside. Her presence alone silenced the room. Tall, steady, Dressed in black with a clipboard tucked under one arm, she looked like a judge arriving at a hearing. She scanned the tables until her eyes found mine. A brief nod passed between us, subtle enough to be mistaken for courtesy, but strong enough to anchor me. She turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying across the chandeliers, "we are experiencing a temporary service hold. Please enjoy your drinks while we resolve the matter." A polite smile followed, but her words had the weight of finality. Service hold. A phrase that sounded harmless, almost bureaucratic, yet in that moment it felt like thunder rolling across the polished floor. Rebecca rose to her feet. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cracking under the strain of forced composure. "There must be a mistake. We confirmed everything this afternoon." The guest turned toward her, curious. Daniel added quickly, "Yes, this is some administrative error. We'll clear it up in a moment." His attempt at control sounded rehearsed, brittle. The room was slipping through his hands. Catherine did not flinch. "The system records show that the final approval has not been submitted. Without it, the kitchen cannot proceed. That is our policy, and it is non-negotiable." Her tone was professional, yet I could feel the shield she offered me. Every word she spoke carried the authority of rules my children had tried so hard to bend. Daniel's face flushed. He looked directly at me for the first time that evening. "Mother," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Are you behind this?" His question hung heavy, not just for me, but for every guest within earshot. The implication was clear. Blame her, embarrass her, corner her into admitting guilt. I lifted my glass of water, took a measured sip, and set it down without answering. The silence was louder than any denial. I watched the ripple it caused, guests shifting, whispers rising, curiosity sharpening. The absence of my voice forced attention back onto my children. They squirmed in the glare. Rebecca tried again. "Mom, please, this is humiliating. Don't you care how this looks? People will think we can't even organize a simple dinner." Her words carried desperation, but they only revealed the crack in her composure. I could see the eyes of family friends at the far end of the table, wide with judgment, recording every syllable in memory. Michael finally spoke, his voice softer than theirs. "Maybe we should just talk to her privately." He glanced toward me, almost pleading. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, hiding behind me on the first day of school, clutching my hand. The memory flickered and died as quickly as it came. He lowered his gaze again, unwilling to choose between blood and conscience. The tension thickened until it felt like a second ceiling pressing down on us. Catherine moved closer, her heels clicking like a metronome of inevitability. She stopped behind my chair. "Miss Hale," she said with formal precision, "would you like me to bring the documents forward?" The air left the room in a collective gasp. Everyone knew what that meant. Documents. Proof. The unspoken promise that something larger than a missing chair was about to surface. I let the pause linger. Power grows in silence, and I had learned to wield it. Finally, I nodded. Catherine inclined her head and stepped back toward the doors. My children's panic sharpened. Daniel leaned across the table, hissing. "Don't do this, not here," Rebecca muttered. "Think about our reputation," Michael whispered. "Please, Mom." Their voices layered like a chorus of desperation, but I remained still. I glanced around the hall. Guests who once laughed freely now sat rigid. Their smiles dissolved into uncertainty. One of my cousins avoided my gaze. Embarrassed for them? An old friend from church looked at me with quiet sympathy. The mirror of their faces reflected the truth my children tried to bury. It was not I who had humiliated them. They had done it to themselves. The doors opened again, and Catherine returned with a slim leather folder pressed against her side. She placed it on the table before me. My children stared at it as if it were a weapon. I traced the edge with my finger, feeling the tension coil tighter. The night had shifted. The stage they built for themselves was no longer theirs. It belonged to me. And though my chair had been missing, my place at the table was more secure than ever. The leather folder sat in front of me like a sealed verdict, waiting to be read aloud. I didn't rush. I allowed the weight of anticipation to stretch across the room, to let every guest feel the gravity of the moment. My children stared at it as though it might burst into flames. Daniel clenched his fists beneath the table. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, and Michael swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a guilty confession. I opened the folder slowly, the sound of paper brushing against paper louder in my ears than the murmurs surrounding me. I withdrew the first document, held it between my fingers, and read aloud in a voice steadier than my pulse. Clause 4A. Final approval of all payments rests solely with the depositor. No exceptions, no proxies, no substitutes. The words echoed against the marble walls. I lifted my eyes and locked them on Daniel. That depositor is me. Gasps rippled through the tables. Someone coughed to cover their surprise. A family friend whispered, "So she paid for this entire thing?" The truth had begun to seep into the cracks of the facade my children had built. I reached into the folder again, sliding out the next piece of evidence, a still photograph printed from the concierge's surveillance system. The image showed Daniel hunched over the desk, Rebecca leaning in beside him, their faces caught in the glow of the monitor. Their intent was unmistakable. They were trying to be me. Rebecca shot to her feet. "This is outrageous!" Her voice cracked, betraying panic. "We were just checking the schedule, not—" She stopped, realizing too late that excuses could not erase the frozen truth in that photograph. Her denial dissolved in the eyes of the guests who studied the picture with cold judgment. Daniel tried to regain control. "Mother, this isn't necessary. Whatever misunderstanding there was, we could have handled it privately." His tone carried the weight of authority, but the edges frayed with desperation. For years he had spoken as if his word were law in our family. Tonight, his law had been broken. I placed the final piece of evidence on the table, a printed email, highlighted in yellow. The subject line, seating plan and drama control. The highlighted line burned like a brand. Optional guest, mother. The hall fell into silence so deep that even the chandeliers seemed to stop trembling. Every eye turned toward me, then toward my children, then back again. The judgment was no longer mine to deliver. It was already written across the faces around us. Michael whispered, "Please stop." His voice cracked with shame. I looked at him. My youngest, the one who once clung to me in fear of the dark. He couldn't bear my gaze now. His shoulders curled inward, shrinking under the weight of betrayal. For a moment, my heart trembled, but I steadied it. Mercy has its place, but not when dignity is at stake. Daniel's voice rose, sharper than before. "So what? You're going to humiliate us in front of everyone? You're our mother. You should protect us, not destroy us." His words were daggers turned inside out, blaming me for the wounds he had carved himself. I met his fury with calm. A mother protects her children, yes, but she does not protect their lies. Rebecca sat down heavily, her glass tipping, red wine spilling across the linen like a spreading wound. The stain grew, seeping toward the edge of the table, unstoppable. It was the perfect image of what had unfolded, once hidden, now impossible to ignore. Around us, guests whispered more openly. An aunt shook her head in disgust. A colleague of Daniel's whispered to his wife, both avoiding his eyes. Catherine stood at the back, arms folded, bearing silent witness. The room that had once celebrated my children now held them in contempt. I gathered the documents and returned them neatly to the folder. My voice was steady as I spoke. You removed my seat tonight, but you forgot that I built this table. Without my approval, there is no celebration. Without my respect, there is no honor. And without my trust, there is no inheritance. My words were not shouted, yet they struck harder than any scream. The silence that followed was not empty, it was judgmental, suffocating. My children sat paralyzed, exposed. I rose from my chair, the one the staff had dragged in for me, and the scrape of its legs against the marble floor sounded like a gavel striking wood. I placed the folder under my arm and looked around the room one final time. Some faces showed pity, others satisfaction, but all reflected truth. The night no longer belonged to my children. It belonged to me. I turned toward the doors, my heels echoing with each step. Behind me, the whispers swelled like a tide I no longer needed to command. My children had sought to erase me, but instead, they had erased themselves. The air outside Riverstone Hall was cold, and the night sky stretched endless above me. I breathed deeply, letting the chill wash away the noise I had left behind. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, not because the burden of motherhood had disappeared, but because I had finally redrawn its boundaries. The following morning, I sat at my oak desk with a pen in hand and a folder of documents laid neatly before me. My first step was to revoke the power of attorney I had given Daniel years ago, back when I believed he would safeguard my interests with the same care I had shown him as a boy. That belief had died last night. I signed the revocation papers slowly, deliberately, knowing each stroke of ink was a thread being cut. The attorney confirmed the cancellation within hours. Daniel's authority over my finances was gone. Next came the trust. For years, I had considered establishing one, but always hesitated, thinking it might signal distrust toward my children. Last night erased all doubt. I finalized the transfer of my estate into a trust managed by an independent firm, naming my granddaughter Lily as the beneficiary. At 12 years old, she still looked at me with unclouded eyes, untouched by the hunger for control that had poisoned her parents. Perhaps by the time she grew older, she would understand why her grandmother had chosen her. I hoped she would remember me not as the woman her parents betrayed, but as the woman who stood her ground. Catherine called later that afternoon. "Margaret," she said gently, "I've documented everything. Your children's names will be flagged in our system. They won't be able to book here again." I thanked her, though no words could measure the comfort it gave me. It wasn't vengeance, it was accountability. Actions have consequences, even for one's own blood. That evening, I opened my social media page, a quiet corner of the internet I rarely visited. I uploaded a photo, the empty chair that had been dragged in for me, sitting slightly apart from the others. Beneath it, I wrote only one sentence. When your children erase your seat, remind them who bought the table. I didn't expect applause, but the message spread quickly. Old friends sent messages of solidarity. Strangers reached out, saying they too had been sidelined by family in ways large and small. My pain had found an echo in the lives of others, and that gave it meaning. As the house settled into silence that night, I sat by the window and let the city lights blur into gold smudges. I thought of Daniel's anger, Rebecca's denial, Michael's silence. A part of me mourned, because a mother always mourns when her children choose betrayal over loyalty. But another part of me felt steadier than ever. Respect, I realized, cannot be demanded endlessly. It must be defended. And sometimes, defending it means walking away from the very people you once carried in your arms. I close the curtains, whispering the words I should have spoken years ago. Respect is not optional. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.